When remaking games, one of the things that can't be so easily recreated is the context surrounding the original game's release. Both us and the games we play have changed in ways that a remake simply cannot imitate. Video games as a whole are better now than they were in 1997, so naturally we expect our video games to be better than they were in 1997. This means that even if you manage to make the exact same game again, only with better graphics and smoother gameplay, there's no guarantee it will be received as favorably as it was the first time around. This is why we have the concept of games aging well or not. Certain games haven't held up as well to the passage of time as others. Usually, this is because path-breaking games, games that were the first of their kinds, tend to amaze us with their novelty, but later fall apart under scrutiny. This is especially true when newer games do the same thing, but better. The best example of this is the N64 game GoldenEye. It was essentially the first good FPS console shooter, and it was incredible at the time. But now, looking back at the game, we can see how fundamentally flawed it was. FPSs got substantially better in quick fashion. Even Perfect Dark, a game released just 3 years after by the same developers, was better in basically every way. Any attempt to remake GoldenEye would very quickly run into this problem, that the source material isn't actually worth remaking. The reason we know this is because it was remade, and it wasn't anything special. This is why it can be tempting not just to remake games, but to modernize them, improve them in ways that were impossible the first time around. After all, the only reason we can remake them is because we're better at making games now. We can do more with the medium than we used to be able to. The corollary to that is, the audience is so much harder to impress now. This is what an amazing video game looked like in the mid-90s. No, wait, that's Terraria. This is what breakout graphics looked like in the mid-90s. You can't simply put a new coat of paint on this and resell it in 2020. If you want to remake this game, you have to completely reinvent its style, its gameplay, the way it approaches story and play. No modern audience would tolerate a game that looked like this. And so, when attempting a remake, developers are faced with a host of competing priorities. It needs to look similar enough to the source material to be recognizable, but redone to line up with the audience's expectations of graphics and realism. It needs to play similar enough to the source material to be evocative of it, but with the details updated to line up with an audience's expectations of exploration and interactivity. In this sense, the story and structure has the most leeway. On the one hand, it can be mostly a shot-for-shot retelling, only done with a modern engine, such as with Resident Evil 2. On the other hand, it can be completely different in every way, except for its general mood and themes, such as with DMC. On the otherest hand, it can seem to be a shot-for-shot retelling, only to insert new story elements to recontextualize it for its new audience. And this finally takes us to the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I'm going to examine how a remake can recontextualize games for a new or returning audience, and how the Final Fantasy VII Remake subverts its fans' expectations in order to do this. Of all the things that influence a remake, the most impactful factor is the one that is also the most difficult to define: nostalgia. For many of these games, Final Fantasy VII very much included, the typical fan hasn't played the game in years, maybe even decades. As such, our memory of the game is far from precise, tied more to how important it is to us than anything about the game specifically. We may remember difficult bosses, the legendary items, and the handful of story moments that stood out, but we don't remember the small scenes, the strange mini-games, the tutorial levels, and everything else that could be said to pad a game's playtime. And with a title like Final Fantasy VII, that nostalgia is a force that cannot be underestimated. The original FF7 was perhaps the most influential JRPG of all time. Its dark themes, deep and complex storylines, and customizable character skills still influence the genre today. This was the first JRPG to become a truly worldwide hit, a game played by millions of people, for many of whom this would be their first game of this type. I remember back in the early 2000s, years after this game was released, and hearing my friends talking about it. These are people whose game collection consisted of sports games, bargain bin fighting games, and Need for Speed, and yet inexplicably, it also included a greatest hits copy of Final Fantasy VII. It just seemed like everyone knew about it and everyone had played it. We were kids back then. Video games were supposed to be exciting and flashy, something you do for an hour between school and hockey practice. And yet, there was Final Fantasy VII, a game focused on story and exploration, a game that is defined less by its moments of play and more by what it has to say. Video games as a whole just weren't like this back then. These days almost every game, from Assassin's Creed to Call of Duty, has story elements and campaigns, main characters and villains, worlds to explore, and secrets to uncover. Back then, good video games were about simple things like cool snowboarding tricks and Run DMC. And so when people think to what Final Fantasy VII is and what it means to them, it's not simply going to be about the game itself, but about how that game was so different from everything else around it. A person's view of the game itself is inseparable from the novelty of it, that experience of, I've never seen something like this before. And this is the unique challenge that comes with remaking FF7, or really any game as influential as it. So in that respect, how should you go about remaking a game like this? It was very early on that Square Enix made clear that this remake would be episodic, expanding on the original game's content and storyline in ways that the original could not. The first episode would be contained within the starting city of Midgar, ending when the party leaves its walls for the first time. And right off the bat, they signaled us to expect changes. After all, that original sequence only took a couple of hours to do in the original. You simply could not meet an audience's 20 to 30 hour playtime expectations without adding substantial story elements. So when a game as influential as Final Fantasy VII is modernized, what parts of it should change? What parts should stay the same? In other words, which elements of the game should we remake and which should we abandon? So first, what do I mean by modernize? In this context, I'm referring specifically to adapting an old game to make it more relevant to today's audiences. Whether those adjustments are to visuals, to gameplay, to story, or to any other aspect of the game, to modernize a game is to make it again using the skills and computing power we didn't have access to the first time around. Now let's approach these categories one at a time. First, the visuals obviously have to be updated. Of all the reasons to remake a game, doing it again with better graphics is one of the key driving factors to their appeal. The visuals of Final Fantasy VII, though still functional, are simply uninspiring when compared to modern games. The visuals of the remake are, of course, top-notch, managing to recreate not just the physical areas and layouts of the original Midgar, but also holistic things like the tone, the color palettes, the mood and feel of being inside the city. Honestly, I could do a whole separate deep dive on how the remake crafted the city of Midgar from the original designs, but instead I'll just leave it at this: it's great. No complaints, no notes. Second, we have the gameplay. Here is where we see the greatest departure. The original FF7, after all, was a turn-based, active-time RPG, which have all but vanished here in 2020. And while these types of battles sparked our imaginations back then, made us fantasize about the epic battles taking place, in reality, they involved running forward, hitting an enemy, and running back to your position in line and waiting for them to hit you. Not exactly awe-inspiring. Ever since the release of Advent Children, Square Enix has been obsessed with finding a way of delivering those types of cinematic battles to the video game world. Of course, this type of combat is entirely at odds with Final Fantasy VII's original system, so they struck a unique compromise wherein your moment-to-moment battles are fluid and freeform, while actions increase your ATB and allow you to perform all those familiar moves from the original that you were hoping to see. In a way, this helps recontextualize the battles of the original game, bringing to life the fights as we imagined them, rather than how they played out on screen. Of course, it's worth pointing out that the combat system isn't the only aspect of Final Fantasy VII's gameplay either. There were a plethora of minigames in the original. Most iconic, of course, is the motorcycle chase. There's also the exploration of Midgar and Wall Market, giving you the chance to learn about the city and its residents. And of course, there's the character customization, from materia to equipment. All of these things contributed to the original game's feel, its effect on its players, and falling short in any one of these categories would have been detrimental to the game's goal of recreating that feeling of playing the original game again. And that feeling of playing FF7 for the first time a second time is the one element they truly focused on remaking. And this takes us to the most impactful and most controversial aspect of the remake: its story. The Midgar section of the game actually has a surprising number of story elements inside of it. From the bombing of Reactor 1, remembering Cloud's promise, the failed bombing of Reactor 5, escaping the Turks with Aerith, Cloud and Dragon, Don Cornero, the train graveyard, the destruction of the plate, the attack on the Shinra building featuring mini-boss Stairs, the return of Sephiroth and Rufus Shinra on the helipad, and finally the crazy motorcycle chase. When you consider each of them individually, it's actually amazing how much the original game packed into its introduction. And since it's the very beginning of an expansive game, this is the part that everyone remembers the strongest. Most of these scenes can be considered iconic in their own right, easily and fondly remembered, and so obviously the remake has to do them better, flashier, go deeper into the details, and bring them to life in ways they couldn't do the first time around. And so it should come as no surprise that the remake hit all these marquee moments. This is something we all expected. But the Final Fantasy VII Remake actually went several steps farther than a simple recreation. Since its original release, FF7 has had multiple spin-offs, including the movie Advent Children, the PSP game Crisis Core, and the weird over-the-shoulder shooter Dirge of Cerberus. As a result, there is a lot of catching up the game has to do to bring it in line with what the spin-offs have added to the lore and to the story. And so there are two competing forces fighting for attention in the remake. The force of constancy, the desire for Final Fantasy VII to play out exactly the way it did in the original, and the force of adaptation, the desire for it to bring the extended universe into play now that we know more about that extended universe. This competition, this battleground, is actually represented in the game itself with these strange ghosts, the ones that I professionally refer to as the voice of the planet, and that I condescendingly refer to as the defenders of canon. These ghosts act out that mental struggle that occurs whenever something plays out on screen, and that voice in the back of your mind screams, "It didn't happen that way." They're the physical manifestation of our desire for nothing to change, for everything to happen exactly the way it did in the original. Like these ghosts, we've all seen what happens before, we know what is supposed to happen, and we cannot accept deviations from that script. But when it comes down to it, things can't happen the exact same way. Our world has changed, our view of video games have changed, our tolerance of ableist slurs have changed, even our view of Final Fantasy VII as a video game has changed since it's released. So whereas the original game can set up our expectations and play with our predictions, our expectations for this remake were, for the most part, decided long before that game was made. This is what created that set of conflicting desires the audience held for it. The desire for it to change substantially, yet leave everything exactly where it was. For it to be new and exciting without it being different or unpredictable. In the end, it was impossible for them to satisfy each of these needs, so they had to make a decision. Should the game change substantially, or should it stay mostly untouched? Well, in the end, they decided the former, to eschew the familiar and embrace change. The ending of Part 1 of the remake is sure to be the most controversial aspect of it. The voice of the planet exists to uphold the world's destiny, the future that is slated to happen. But for some reason, things aren't proceeding according to that design, so the voices intervene to ensure that they do happen as it was intended. It becomes apparent here that we, the audience, are also voices of the planet. We see all of these scenes from the future, these scenes from our childhood, and know that we want those to happen again. We had ordained from the very beginning that the game must proceed in a particular way, that the events of the future have already been decided, and it only remains for the characters to act them out as we know they're supposed to. And everything that happens outside of this script is met with discomfort, even hostility. This wasn't supposed to happen. But the Final Fantasy series has always fought against the concept of fate. The original game's heroes broke out of a stable time loop that ensured the world's continuous destruction, and ever since, this theme of fighting against destiny has reoccurred in all of these Final Fantasy titles. So it should be no surprise that the Final Fantasy VII Remake, after being locked into a world of nostalgia by its fanbase, has decided to fight back. Absolutely nothing is set in stone anymore, even things that are fundamental to the beginnings of the story were thrown into question in this final scene. They have promised in a big way that absolutely everything is in the air and we can have absolutely no expectations going forward. Anything can change, anything can happen. And when you think about it, that they were able to do that is incredible. This is a game that for the better part of 2 decades has been heralded as the greatest video game ever made. And now, I know what you're thinking, wait a second, isn't my favorite video game the greatest game ever made? To which I will say, sorry it's not. The reason for that is because your favorite game is, to be honest, too jumbled, too basic, too repetitive, too confusing, that too jumbled one again, but this time even more jumbled, too get good, too spoopy, too much dating of teenagers, and of course, too much weapon breakage, 7 out of 10. So despite Final Fantasy VII being sacrosanct to a particular portion of its audience, Square Enix has basically decided that they don't care. They don't want you to even think you know what's going to happen next. You think that after all of this, Aerith is going to die? Psych! Actually, this time Cloud dies, and Tifa falls into the lifestream, only for Cid and Yuffie to launch themselves into space where they drop a nuclear bomb onto the meteor to blow it up, crisis averted. Do I think this is what's going to happen this time around? I honestly don't know. That's the beauty of what they've done here. By opening the floodgates of change, they've given us the ability to speculate about what happens next. This is something that shouldn't normally be possible in a remake like this. Before this game, everyone knew how the story played out. Now, we don't know anything for certain. And that leaves us with the same sense of wonder, of guessing, of wild speculation that you would get from any other episodic video game. And sure, we know what's probably going to happen and have a general idea of where the story is supposed to go, the things that are and are not going to happen. But at the same time, if you asked me a few months ago if Sephiroth stabbed Barret at the top of Shinra Tower, the answer would have been an easy no. Sephiroth stabs Barret in Disneyland. Everyone knows that Sephiroth stabs Barret in Disneyland. What I'm trying to say is that when they gave themselves the power to change any and all aspects of the story, they unlocked this new capacity for wonder, for discovery. They returned us to that mystery, that feeling of what's going to happen next. And that did something that few, if any, remakes had done before, restored that feeling of playing Final Fantasy VII for the first time. You normally only get one chance to experience that. But here, because they opened up that potential, we get to relive that memory and feel it all over again. And sure, I'm worried about what might change if the things that I liked most about this game might be erased in the name of novelty. But even if they do that, the old Final Fantasy VII will still be there. If the only thing I wanted was to relive the old and familiar, I could have at any time gone back and played that game. But this is a new game. This is a new story. There's no telling what's going to happen next, and maybe that's better than knowing exactly what's going to happen next. And this is what makes the FF7 remake stand out from other remakes. While the typical remake is simply an homage, a love letter to an old game, this is a ground-up recreation. And by ground-up recreation, I don't simply mean they redesigned the engine and all the character models from scratch. I mean, they drilled down to the foundation of the game, to the ideas and concepts that made it stand out in the first place, and sought to recreate that. The goal wasn't simply to make Final Fantasy VII again, but to make us feel like we were playing Final Fantasy VII for the first time, a second time. And if we're doomed to see every popular game of the last century remade and remastered, it would be nice to see more of this type of remake.